Hi there, it's Kevin with Rogue Deck Builder here with a rant video. This one is going to expand on the conversation I was having yesterday on the topic of cards that would need to be banned to fix standard. Now, that is a lot to ask for because I think there are layers upon layers of problems with standard that just go back to both design and play design not being able to do their jobs adequately. And I think one of the major reasons with play design is they have this notion of needing to sell packs and get these cards to be able to perform in Commander. It's especially Commander. It really seems like Commander is ruining Standard. They keep trying to have these mythics that are pushed for Commander so they can see play, and that's a whole nother topic about Commander, where the power level of Commander just continues to be pushed, and so you have to create these better and better cards so that people will actually want to use them in their Commander decks, and it's just something I don't think is going to be self-sustainable. I mean, it's got to end somewhere. There's got to be a power reset sometime in the future for cards to, I mean, once they hit that power level, they'll have to fundamentally change the game at that point. And talking about fundamentally changing the game, there is one of the major problems that I'm seeing with Standard is in the higher converted mana cost cards either being able to be cheated into play or having these cost reductions. Especially when you couple it with them bringing back some of the best control cards we've had in a long time. Like the Heartless Act is one of the probably arguably the best. It's better than Doomblade because it's something that's more versatile than a Doomblade or an Ultimate Price. Of course, there are some creatures that do have counters on them, but something a Heartless Act can actually take care of cards with counters, so it's even more versatile in that aspect. And then we have some really good removal spells in the form of counter spells like Drown in the Loch, and just neutralizes a very, very efficient counter spell, and a lot of decent board wipes in the format that kind of push the mid-range, the how mid-range used to be played. I'm very curious if Siege Runner would actually even see play in today's Standard with all of these other cards that are just, I think the power level, I mean, Siege Runner doesn't even see much play in Pioneer, and a lot of these cards are seeing tons of play that I'm going to talk about in Pioneer or in Modern or in various other formats. So the whole philosophy with how they used to do the curve, where a 2-drop was slightly better than a 1-drop, which is slightly better, or a 3-drop slightly better than a 2-drop, and the curve just naturally had that progression. And what was happening is if you have a game of Magic that typically ends on turn 6 or turn 7, it meant that cards in that 5, 6, 7, 8 range were just not played that often based upon how their power was next to these cards that came out early. So what they did is they created a lot of ramp spells so you could actually ramp to them and get those out a little bit early. But it seems like that philosophy has changed to where they are making the payoffs for these 5, 6, 7, 8 converted mana costs so good that you don't even need, like, it's the payoff without taking into account the ramp for these cards, and it just really pushed them. And then when you couple in the fact that there are ways to cheat these cards, they become scenarios where you either have to answer these cards or you lose like the following turn. And I think that those type of cards are always bad for the format. Cards that were recently rotated or banned, like Wilderness Reclamation or Fires of Invention, I think are just scratching the surface at this problem of reducing mana cost, cheating cards into play, or just having a card just do too much. What I like to call the word salad cards, where they just do so many things on one card. So anyway, yeah, I wish that design would change its tone, but looking at the Kaldheim spoilers, it just seems more of the same. There have already been cards that have been spoiled that seem that they are like all-in cards, really push cards, I win button cards, cheating to play cards, and I am just not excited about the direction of Kaldheim. So hopefully in the future, though, after Throne of Eldraine rotates, and I think that's what it's going to take at this point, we can have a decent Standard. All right, so with that introduction, here are the cards that I think I personally would axe. I'd just get rid of them. They mainly are from Throne of Eldraine. The set was just such a mistake. It's already had a bunch of cards banned from it. But these are the cards that I am, particularly when I'm deck designing, it's like, well, got to put this card in it, or I am losing to this card over and over and over again. And often, it's not the first copy of these cards, it's the second or the third copy of these cards. And I know it's some anecdotal evidence, but I've been trying to brew decks that do not use these cards, and it is near impossible in the format currently to make a deck that does not use these cards, because all roads lead to running these particular cards because they're strictly better than everything else. All right, that was a mouthful. Let's get on to the first one. The first one is the Great Henge. The Great Henge, I think, is a very, very problematic card. It really feels like this card was made for Commander to get the value out of cards that are like Commander. It gets reduced, you can gain a lot of life, draw a lot of cards. Just feels very Commander to me. But when you pair it in the exact same set as Lovestruck Beast, and you have scenarios where you can curve into a Great Henge on turn 4, and then not only do your cards enter the battlefield, I mean, when you compare this card to the God out of, I know it's a mythic versus an uncommon, but if you compare it out of the God out of Theros, it's just laughable that a 4-mana card that can be easily removed does just one of the abilities, just the +1/+1 counter of creatures entering the battlefield, whereas this can be cast for on turn 4 very easily. There's a few cards that can enable it, and we'll talk about those in a second. And then not only do you get a +1/+1 counter, you draw a card, you gain 2 life. It actually gives you mana when you tap it. And it's just is backbreaking against the Great Henge and is pushing out any other mid-range type strategies from being playable. It also is giving green the ability to act like blue. One of the big problems I'm having with green right now is it just does everything. It has card draw, arguably better card draw right now. Even if you take out Great Henge, there are plenty of card draws in green that are arguably better than blue. So it's playing that sort of route of drawing cards. It has built-in life gain on a bunch of cards. It has built-in graveyard removal in the forms like Scavenging Ooze and other cards that remove the graveyard, which used to be something that green does do. I'm not saying that it shouldn't have that. Green, traditionally, that wasn't the color pie for something they do, is get rid of the graveyard. But then they also have the advantage of having the best artifact and enchantment removal. And now, with these fight cards or just creatures dealing damage to planeswalkers or players or creatures, now you almost have that direct damage feel as well as some of the best removal in that form that the game's ever seen. We've come a long way from the 4-mana, I'm trying to think of the 4-mana card where it comes into play and a creature fights. I mean, we have really, really efficient cards like Primal Might, that are great fight cards and great removal that actually don't see that much play, but they still are an option for green. And then the thing that makes green even more pushed is we have the best creature package in green, like cards like Questing Beast, like the Mammoth, and then they also do pair very well with cards like the Great Henge, and it's just the perfect storm for green to just be so pushed that it's very, very tough for other decks, whether it be aggro or control, to compete with this. The problem with the Great Henge decks right now is many of them do play both an aggro and a mid-range, and even do have the control type feel to it with things like the Shatterskull Summit. So it's just these decks just do everything. There are no holes in the Great Henge game plan, and that is a worrisome thing because usually for a healthy standard, you have a glaring hole in a particular deck. Like a deck could lose to like a synergistic deck or a combo deck or a control deck or an aggro deck. There's always that one hole for a deck to be exploited, and that's what we call the meta game, where you can pick a deck if this deck ever does become the top dog. And I would say that we're really not in that scenario. Yeah, there are decks that have a slight advantage over the Great Henge decks, but it seems like we always keep coming back to the Great Henge. There will be a week of like a Yorion deck or whatnot, but then the Great Henge will come back and just be the top dog. So if you actually look at the MTG Goldfish decks too, it gives a little bit of misleading information. It says Dimir Control here is the #1 played deck, but this is actually not the #1 winning decks. These are including a lot of 1/3s and whatnot. And I think that this deck is definitely a good option if you actually look at all the top finishes. Gruul Adventures far and away is the best deck. And what really irks me is that Wizards of the Coast has these statistics. They have the statistics of how many times the Great Henge, how many cards the Great Henge is drawing, how much like power that it's bringing on board. And like I said, in my experience brewing all these other decks against Great Henge decks, it's not like I'm going in blind and not having having an answer for the Great Henge. I typically do have cards that can deal with Great Henge, but it's usually that second or third copy that is going to be the deciding factor, and they've got too much advantage out of the first and the second, and that third one is just the difference, the back-breaking difference to them coming back and being able to just take over the game. One of the matchups I just played against was there was a third Great Henge, so top deck a Great Henge, hard cast it, and the next turn throw out it was an elemental. So let's just take a look at the deck. So they threw out an elemental, the Brushfire Elemental, which drew a card and it entered the battlefield as a 2/2. Then drew a Questing Beast, entered the battlefield as a 5/5, played a Fabled Passage, which then led the Brushfire Elemental up to a 4/4, cracked the Fabled Passage and made it a 6/6, and swung in for 11 damage, which was perfect lethal to where I'd stabilized at. And it was just a crazy scenario, and these type of scenarios are not rare. This isn't like the magical Christmas land happening. This is what this deck is meant to do, that it can come back from nothing and just be able to take over the game. I'm very surprised this particular deck is only running 2 Great Henges, because the Great Henge is just such a monster in this deck and the synergies that it has with it. So let's talk about these synergies and why I think it's pushed. Very first thing is a Lovestruck Beast. This is arguably the most efficient card ever printed to pair with the Great Henge. We've had cards like the 7/6 for 3 mana that rotated, but it was black. Lovestruck Beast puts out a 1/1. It bleeds back a 5/5 body. If you take care of the 1/1, Lovestruck Beast can't attack, but it can still block, and it curves perfectly for a turn 4 Great Henge. The Khazanu Mammoth can also do it. The Khazanu Mammoth can come into play on turn number 3, and then turn number 4 turn into a 5/5, and on curve again, throw out the Great Henge. Another card that can do it as well is the Brushfire Elemental with a Fabled Passage. Brushfire Elemental can come out on turn number 2. Turn number 3, you can play a Fabled Passage, crack it to the 5/5. You can't quite get the mana out on that turn, but on a turn 4 scenario, same thing. You can reduce it by 5 and then cast it for 4 mana. You can also do it with if you are running the Mana Dork versions of running like a Goose or one of the other cards, one of the 2 Mana Dorks, you can get these scenarios out even a turn quicker if you're in the right deck. What pushes it over the top too is how well it pairs with arguably the best mechanic that was printed out of Throne of Eldraine, which is the adventures. They continue to try to ban adventure pieces. They got rid of the Lucky Clover, but still we got the Edgewall Innkeeper that has the perfect curve with the Lovestruck Beast and with the Great Henge, and has the built-in card draw to then go find you even more stuff. So this deck is doing everything. It is having adequate aggro. It's arguably even more powerful at the moment than even like an all-out aggro with mono red. The Brushfire Elemental is always going to be a very good threat. It's even got this built-in nuance here that if it doesn't have a land drop, then if you have taken care of one of the 1/1s, it's a 1/1 for your Lovestruck Beast to attack in. And it has other cards like Questing Beast and Mammoth that can get huge. And then we have the Bone Crusher Giant that has a built-in shock, the 4/3, and the 2 damage if you target it. So this is a very, very tough deck to attack because it just does everything. And then when you go into the sideboard, they have options for many other cards that can push them over the top against whatever decks you're running. If it be a mill-based deck, you have the Ox of Agonis that allows you to get a lot of value back there, or the Phoenix of Ash, and then it has cards like Wilt that are great. You can even run the Thrashing Bronzodon in this kind of package here. Fire Prophecy, which is a very, very efficient red card that not only does 3 damage to a creature, but allows you to get rid of a land or something, or an excess copy of an Embercleave or a Great Henge. So I'm thinking for this has been around for a long enough time that I think the Gruul Adventures is definitely a problem in the format. It's pushing out any other deck that does a similar, why play anything but Adventures with the Great Henge Embercleave package, and it's about time. I think they need to address this, especially with like the banning of Euro. That was like one card that was pretty good against stabilizing against this particular deck, and even this deck had cards like Scavenging Ooze that could give them a bit of an oomph versus that deck. So in my opinion, that's the first card that absolutely needs to go, is the Great Henge. If I were to chop one card, it would be the Great Henge. So let's go on to my number 2 card, which is no surprise, is Embercleave. I actually don't think the Embercleave is as backbreaking as the Great Henge. You can play around it. A lot of removal is pretty good versus it. But the problem with Embercleave is it doesn't have that 2-for-1 feel like other cards in the past. There have been auras that do this, where you cast an aura, gives something double strike, or let's say the Temur Battle Rage. Temur Battle Rage was a 2-mana spell that gave double strike and trample. It like those cards existed and they were good enough. And so Embercleave is very efficient with both the mono red deck as well as the Gruul Adventures deck because of cards like Lovestruck Beast, being able to put that 1/1 token out. Then that basically is going to reduce the cost when you're ready to attack in. But what makes Embercleave so good is it isn't a 6-mana spell, it's a 5-mana spell. And that actually is on curve with a lot of things like Questing Beast, or like a big if we go back to the Gruul Adventures deck, like a Kazandu Mammoth after a land, that's going to hit for 12 damage with the Embercleave. Same thing with like the Brushfire Elemental. Brushfire Elemental having haste and then being able to move over the Embercleave to the Brushfire Elemental is going to hit for a massive amount of damage. And it's just become a card that you have to dedicate so much to play around it, that it doesn't even feel like you ever 2-for-1 it. It's very easy just to, at that point, re-equip it to even a 1/1, and then you have something that's attacking in for 4 damage. And it's, to me, it just does too much for one card, giving first or double strike and trample with a very, very low cost of 2 mana. Many times it's only 2 mana in these decks, and then being able to flip it over with the equip for 3 is just far and above better than any other equipment at that point, and has just been a card that has been problematic for the format. It is a card too that has those scenarios: either you win big or you lose big, or not even if you really lose big. It's like you answer Embercleave, you're out of the clear for a turn, but it doesn't really feel like you've lost any momentum, because then you can throw it on another creature. Every threat they put out, when you have hasters especially, is going to make you hold up mana to solve Embercleave, which pushes out a lot of other decks to being able to do what they want to do. And eventually then you can, holding up removal, and then they drop something like a Vivian or a Great Henge, and then they're back in the game that way. So Embercleave is another card that I think if they keep in the format is just going to continue to be a problem. It was too much for one card, and I think that it doesn't make, when you're now analyzing a card, does this card actually make the format better or worse? Is it adding to more deck diversity? Is it adding for fun games? Is it adding a needed niche in the format? And in my opinion, it is not. And the Embercleave is just a card that is a headache of a card. It does too much for what it is, and leads to some very magical Christmassy land scenarios with Fabled Passage and giving a landfall creature that big boost for basically nothing. So I think Embercleave is seen enough time in Standard. It's been a problem card. I think that one of the problems with the Standard of the past, with like Wilderness Reclamation and Fires of Invention, a lot of the blame had to go with Embercleave, because you had to run so many cards to answer the Embercleave decks, that then these big mana decks just beat you up with their big mana. So if we do ban Embercleave, then we must ban the next card. The next card that I think is a very same sort of category. Does it make the format better? Does it make it more fun? Does it make it more diverse? This is Ugin. I have seen Ugin being slotted into the decks, so many decks, that it just doesn't even make sense to throw an Ugin in, but you might as well. I've seen it in mono green food, where it's just, well, might as well throw an Ugin in. We're already, ramping pretty well with our deck. I've seen it played in a mono white deck. It was just a mono white with Elspeth Conquers Death and some other removals, but it was mainly like Skyclave Apparition. So it was a mono white control deck that was just trying to get to an Ugin. We see it right now in an Esper, or not an Esper deck, just a Yorion Dimir deck. And Ugin's the big finisher there. It's just too easy of a finisher to justify throwing it in any deck. It does too much for a card. 8 mana is not hard in this format. We'll be talking about a few other cards that I think really push this over the top. You can't print Ugin with some of the best ramp spells ever printed. It just leads to some really, really bad scenarios where Ugin just... And the biggest problem with Ugin is it's an answers all card. You just chuck it out, and there are plenty of decks that just fold to Ugin. And for that reason, I just don't think that this is a card that is good for Standard. I don't think it was good the last time. I was very surprised they reprinted it. I always expected Ugin to be printed in some sort of master set, as the price of Ugin was going up. And it didn't add, in my opinion, anything good for the Fate Reforged time period for Ugin. And yes, you can keep it in check. There are a few decks that do very well, like Rogues can do very well against the Ugin decks because Ugin is just such a liability. But it leads to a lot of cheat scenarios. There are a few ways to actually cheat Ugin out. And if you are in, like I was mentioning at the very first of this video, where we've printed some of the best removal ever, some of these the best removal packages ever, you can just remove, and then Ugin is your win con. It feels very Teferi at that point, where Teferi can be your control card and your win card all in one. And that's exactly what Ugin is doing. So I don't think the format is better with this card in it. I think that it would open wide up for decks that can compete with these other shells if Ugin was not in that. If Ugin just wasn't a lot of mid-range decks or synergy decks I think would be viable if Ugin was not a deck. And it'd be interesting to see those decks being played. Like a party deck I think would be viable if Ugin wasn't in the format. I think some of these other like highly synergistic decks, like some of the ones that I've been playing, Ugin is just a massive problem. And again, it's not that first Ugin, it's usually the second or the third Ugin that really takes over the game and wins it. It's just too much value and too much resources used to take care of Ugin by that point. All right, moving on. Those are like the top three. I think these three, no, I'd put the next ones in here. So let's actually skip to, well, we'll talk about those last. So there's one other glaring problem that I think that needs to be addressed with Standard. We'll get to that in a second, but the other card that I would ban currently would be Genesis Ultimatum. And Genesis Ultimatum is very interesting that they haven't banned it. They kept it alive when they banned Escape to the Wilds. I don't think that Escape to the Wilds is anywhere near as powerful as Genesis Ultimatum. One of the things that made Escape to the Wilds so good was Lucky Clover, and I don't think that without Lucky Clover, I think Escape gets a lot worse. So it exiles the top 5 of your cards of your library. You can play cards exiled this way on a turn. You can play additional land. So it's going to ramp you into a 5 into a 7, which again is going to make Ugin a problem because then you can get it. But I've played a lot of Escape to the Wilds. There are a lot of scenarios where you have to use your mana on controlling the board, and then the cards you actually do want to cast end up getting exiled with Escape to the Wilds. You don't end up being able to get the good bang for the buck for Escape to the Wilds. And I played a lot of Teamer Adventures back the previous rotation, and Escape was it was the card that, I mean, there were a lot of other cards that were just as viable. It was a big mana deck, so you did get some additional love from being able to play an additional land this turn. And the excellent of the top 5 cards of the library wasn't as bad because you could typically play the adventure spells and then be able to cast them later on. So without Lucky Clover, though, I really don't think that Escape the Wilds is as good as some of the other alternatives right now in the format. Like even into the story, just drawing the 4 cards for very similar mana at that point, I think is just as powerful as this particular card. Genesis Ultimatum, though, Genesis Ultimatum is just a powerhouse, especially when you have Ugin and you have the Giant and you have the it doesn't matter if you're going the Shark Tornado route or if you're going the Ugin route or if you're going the Terror route. Genesis Ultimatum leads to some very, very crazy plays, some very lucky plays like the Haymaker I was talking about earlier, where Genesis Ultimatum just hits a couple Giants and one of the Terror of the Peaks and just wins the game right there because the Giants come in as a 8/8s or at that point they can easily come in as 10/10s and then just do 20 damage to the face right there. The Genesis Ultimatum puts those permanents into play. So Escape puts them into your hand. Genesis Ultimatum just really puts them right on the board into play. There's your Ugins, there's your Shark Tornadoes. Genesis Ultimatum usually finds another Genesis Ultimatum. But the biggest issue with Genesis Ultimatum right now is the ramp package. So there's just, the fixing is too good right now in the form of both the migration pack and our path and the most of them actually aren't even playing. It's the Cultivate. Cultivate's being played in a bunch of these Genesis Ultimatum decks because it goes and gets the specific colors that you need with Cultivate, puts a land in hand, puts a land on the battlefield, and then there are a lot of flavors you can go with this. Like here's one that actually, the Cure Best the Sea God is even a very viable option for this deck, or you can go the Terror of the Peaks. Terror of the Peaks does have synergy. This is actually pretty cool, the Cure the Best the Sea God. But you can also go Ugin with this particular deck. You can also go Shark Tornado with this. And the Terror of the Peaks Beanstalk Giant also has the pairing that a lot of them do go with, like Bone Crusher Giants and Love Struck Beasts. and then just go into the adventure cell. So there's a lot of way that they mix and match these sort of archetypes to just go like a bigger mana deck. And I think that this is another card that really doesn't add to anything to the format. It's just strictly better than a lot of what these other mid-range type strategies can go, or ramp type strategies. You're just going to ramp into Genesis Ultimatum, and then feels like an Aetheric Marvel. It really does. That's the card that I would compare Genesis Ultimatum to. Is just you spin the wheel. Sometimes you can miss and get a bunch of garbage. Sometimes you can hit the perfect scenario and get out of Beanstalk Giant and tear the peaks and just be in huge position to take over the game. If you're in the Ugin route or the Shark Tornado, same thing. You can hit a Shark Tornado and fill your hand back up with some, like another Genesis Ultimatum. You have a 7/7 that's coming out the next turn, and maybe hit another big spell at that point. It's just something that I don't think adds to deck diversity, fun, and again, it's all subjective. It's teach their own of how they think Magic should be played, but I, for one, miss the days of the really grindy. Like, man, it's Jund versus Soul Sisters. That was some of my most fun time in Magic the Gathering. It's modern, but it was a time period of modern where there was combo, but it really was these tit for tat, outplay your opponent, who can be a better resource manager of their deck. A lot of skill that was involved in Magic, and when you have these haymaker type formats where you just swing a Genesis Ultimatum, it takes the skill out of Magic. I mean, look, what does this deck have as far as interaction with your opponent? A Brazen Borrower? There's not a lot. It's you cast your cards, you hope to get a Genesis Ultimatum that hits some stuff, and that's that. I mean, a few other spells like Fire Prophecy, Disruption, but these are probably, like, these two, the game isn't going to make the decision for you. There is a very small window for the Disruption where it's actually good to hold it up to counter something if your opponent, what they're on curve for. And same with Fire Prophecy. Fire Prophecy is more in here for filtration than it is. It's just removal and filtration to try to dig you towards those right cards. So I don't know. I just am not a fan of these type of haymaker decks. They're very repetitive. They push a lot of decks that just cannot compete with them. Again, what are you going to do with a mid-range deck to try to play against a Genesis Ultimatum deck? And if you keep or if you ban something like the Great Henge, but keep something like Genesis Ultimatum, then I think that we just see that shell go into more of this type of shell. So I think that for that reason, they both need to go. However, here's another little caveat to this. There are many decks that run both. I've seen decks with Genesis Ultimatums and Great Henges in the same deck because it's a very easy pairing with like the Lovestruck Beast, or like in this one, the Khazanu Mammoth, to have that initial threat with the Great Henge with many of these creatures, if you go more of a creature-based route. And then the Great Henge can just take over the game and draw you into more stuff. So yeah, just a very problematic card that I don't think is making the format any better by having it exist. Now, last but not least is not a banning of a card. I just think it's time just to get rid of Companion. Companion is still a problem of a mechanic. I don't think that the 3 mana really sets back some of the cards like Yorion or Lurrus, and it's especially Yorion that's the issue. 20 cards, adding 20 cards to your deck is not an issue, especially when there's a mill deck in the format. So having 20 cards with so many repetitive cards right now, Black has a ton of repetitive removal spells. There are plenty of things to flicker and draw for Yorion, like the Maze Mind Tomes and the Omens and whatnot, that it doesn't even feel like you get any less or any higher variabilities in your deck by having to add 20 cards. And 3 mana to throw a Yorion in your hand is like having every deck, if they had the option to take a very, very pertinent card out of their sideboard for 3 mana, yeah, that's pretty busted. And they can't, like, the other companions are definitely a joke. They've always have been a joke, though, comparatively speaking to, like, it really was Osmodoth, Yorion, and Lurrus. Those were the big 3. We saw a few other companions sort of see play from time to time, but these 3 were the big problems that made them actually have to change the companion mechanic to having that 3 mana. Again, though, with Yorion, it's just not that big of a handicap to be throwing 20 cards in your your deck. And what is really disappointing about like Loris and Yorion is they're probably the best cards ever printed with this ability, and they didn't skim on their power and toughness either. A 4/5 flyer for 5 mana is pretty decent, especially when it blocks many of the cards with four power in this format. There are quite a few of them. The Yorion is just a big roadblock. And there are many cards too that have with Theros that have these ETB enchantments that then can get flickered and get a ton of value. You have cards like the Elspeth Conquers Death. You have the Omens. You have the Prince. All these things just pair so well with the Orion to be able to flicker it and just get so much value. And I'm not saying the card shouldn't exist, but I think that Yorion should be in the deck. I think that it's just too easy as a companion. It's not any sort of deck restriction to put 20 more cards that in this format with Mill, like I said, could actually be an advantage. And it's time for companion to go. It was a bad mechanic. It wasn't thought through. It should have had some other just 3 men. No, it's just I can't justify it whatsoever. And I put Loris in this category as well. Loris is just one of the, and that's how companions will be going forward. They're just going to give such an advantage to when the card pool has more and more cards, where you can just chuck together converted mana cost 2 or less. That's not a big issue if you have a guaranteed recursion card that you can cast from your sideboard. And the problem with Loris is it's fitting in like rogues. I don't think it was ever really meant for like a like rogues are so efficient coming out on turn 1 and turn 2, and then but they have a lot of higher converted mana cost spells that can actually be paired with Loris, and they can get away with having these cards and having enough finishers in those forms available. And then I think that if you don't, like, what's going to end up happening is if you ban these Great Hinges and the other cards I've talked about, is then we're just going to get plagued with both Yorion and Loris decks. And having them in the deck, I think, is fine. Having them in the sideboard to be pulled out as a companion is basically giving another deck 8 cards versus 7 cards. And that is never going to lead to a fair Magic, in my opinion. And Loris is seeing plenty of play right now in Standard. You can go of course, the Dimir Rogues is the go-to, what people are running Loris in, but I've seen Loris in many other decks, like these Orzhov Auras is actually viable right now in Standard, and we still have Cycling too. That Cycling is still a complete deck. Cycling is suffering from basically Gruul at the moment because it's got such a bad matchup versus Gruul. That it's got a bad matchup versus Rogues too, but that's how I think the power level of this standard might even be better than like the Wilderness Reclamation standard with some of these more aggressive cards that have been able to pair with these cards that have what we call it kind of the staying power or the ability to come back after board wipes and whatnot. So yeah, Loris, Yorion, I think they're fine as cards if they're in the deck. Companion is just a mistake. So the format goes a little bit deeper of problematic cards. There are a few other design cards that I am not the biggest fan of. Questing Beast is another card that just makes me shake my head. It's just another word salad card with Vigilance, Death Touch, Haste. Can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. I mean, what in the world do you want a card to do? It's just too much on one card. I put the same thing with this Brushfire Elemental. You really had to add the Brushfire Elemental can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. Like, just a weird addition to a card that is already aggressive enough. When you pair it with Fabled Passage, same thing, a 5/5 for 2 mana. They can get on there at turn. As we get even more cards that possibly can ramp, Brushfire Elemental just gets even more problematic as time goes on. But again, they're fairish cards, comparatively speaking to the cards that I'm complaining about. I still think they're bad design. However, they're fine for the moment. Talked about Fabled Passage in the past. That's still a card that I think is very weird with the landfall. It's pushed a lot of these landfall cards over the top. I think they're good. I don't think any of these landfall cards are terrible without Fabled Passage. You still, like, the Ruined Crab is still fine. It makes like the Gazandu Mammoth and the Brushfire Elemental a lot more fair. But if you do get rid of Embercleave and the Great Henge, then that's not going to be the biggest issue with the Fabled Passage payoff with these particular cards. Into the Story, I'm not a fan of. I think that they've made card draw too good. With very, very, again, there's not a lot of restrictions. I think when they designed Into the Story, it was more in mind of like the late game. You get a reduction of cost where you can draw some cards and still hold up some mana for some control cards. Putting in instant speed was also an issue. Another thing that I think that they should address is moving over flash. I think that flash should not be in blue and black. I think that flash on creatures, like my theory with Magic is that they should be mirrored in what they do. So if creatures are sorcery speed, you get instant speed removal. You get instant speed stuff. So you have to cast your cards on your turn and respond to your opponents on your like instant spell removal spell on their turn. So green can have the flash creatures, and the same thing should be said for their control cards. Their control cards should all be like a sorcery speed control card, and a lot of them are with like creatures that have an ability to come into play and fight. Those are sorcery speed. So if I were to kind of fix the color pie of Magic, I would give flash over to white and over to green for creatures, and then take it away from blue, because it really pushes these other decks over the top where you can hold up removal and you can flash in creatures. So it gives a damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario against a lot of decks that have to, spend their mana, or like you can't play land go versus something like Dimir Rogues, because they're just going to outvalue by flashing in those creatures or holding up removal, holding up counter spells, and whatnot. It's just become so efficient with these card draws, putting an instant speed on something like Into the Story, where you're milling your opponents. It adds too much value out of one card. These things, though, I think will be fine. At the moment, I think that if these particular cards that I talked about were banned and were axed, I think that the format would widen up substantially. So I'd like to know your comments in the comment section below about what cards you think are most problematic. But as you can see from the decks, though, basically all these cards but Dimir Control. And I'm not a fan of this card. Don't even start on the conspiracy theory that this is the deck I play. I don't play Dimir Control, but here's your conspiracy theory. A lot of the decks I've been brewing lately don't have a bad matchup versus Dimir Control. So take that for whatever it's worth. I think there's a lot of answers right now for Dimir Control. I think Pelukronos is very good. I think the Spider is super good versus Dimir Control for green. There are plenty of cards that have recursion that get value out of being milled. Like I think this Rakdos deck could come back. This Rakdos, I don't see Rakdos Sacrifice, but the Rakdos self-mill strategy is actually pretty decent versus Dimir Control, because they really feed the graveyard. But if you see the rest of these decks, though, they all have a common theme here. Here's the Gruul, the mono green. They are really great henge decks. They are and here, yeah, let's actually, before I end this video, I know it's a very long ranty video, let's just take a look, though, at this one. Does this deck fold without the great henge? I would say no. You still have your draw in the form of Trail of Crumbs. You'd have to just go up to 4 of Trail of Crumbs, and then you can have Vivian play that role. You can throw Vivian in the role of the Great Henge. It's a much more fair card. It's easy to answer. And then you still have this shell. This shell would not go away. So when they ban cards, this is typically what they look for. Do I have to kill an entire archetype if this card goes away? Does this archetype go away without the henge? Nope. If we go back over to the Gruul Adventures, does it kill the archetype if henge is gone? Nope. It's still, this package will still be good. Let's go over to some of these other ones here. Does Esper Doom Foretold, if we just throw it over into the main deck, yeah, it's still a deck. It still can work. Temur Ramp, can it work without the Genesis Ultimatum? Well, probably not without Genesis Ultimatum, but there still is, you can still ramp into those cards and hardcast those cards and still be fine, in my opinion. I mean, what ultimately, that's what's really pushing this deck over the top. You don't draw your Genesis Ultimatum, you're still getting 2-for-1s out of all of these cards like Brazen Borrower and Beanstalk Giant, and the even like Terror of the Peaks is definitely like a 2-for-1 card. Cure the Best, the Sea God, is still a 2-for-1 card. If you're ramping into, other big mana cards, you're still, doing what a big mana ramp deck wants to be doing. And Genesis Ultimatum just really pushes over top. So I think it would still exist without Genesis Ultimatum. If you look over at some of these other decks, though, look at these ones that might actually start to see some play down in this. And this is what is really telling about Embercleave, is that Golgari Adventures is unplayable right now. And they are so similar. They use the vast majority of cards. This is not one that I want to be giving this is a bad example right here, but because most of them should be running the Great Henge here. Great Henge, I've run Golgari, and it felt very similar, but the issue is it always felt like you're one step behind. Your black cards were just strictly worse than what the Gruul deck was doing, because there wasn't. If you want to kind of play this route, you're going to lose right now in Standard because you'll lose the big mana cards. So if you're trying to play this tit for tat, Murderous Riders, Rankles, and then Bloodchief's Thirst, these type of cards, you're going to get beat by like an Ugin that then wipes your board. You're going to get beat by a Genesis Ultimatum that comes down and gets a bunch of value. You're going to get beat by, and you're not going to do the other side of the equation as good as Gruul. Gruul's going to get those bigger creatures out early. They're going to have more of the Shatterskull summoning that works more synergistic, the Embercleave to push over the top, and it's just no point right now to be playing the Golgari Adventures over Gruul Adventures. So I think that Golgari Adventures could actually be a thing again. I think Mono Red Aggro could be a thing again because it would push, it'd make you actually choose between Gruul or Mono Red. They both have their pluses and minuses, but right now Gruul Adventures just, in my opinion, does the aggro route better than Mono Red Aggro does with the Mammoth and the Elemental. Mono White Aggro could come back. Some of these blue-red card draws. This is another one that is just like, these decks seem like that they're the complete package. These type of decks have been good in the past with like the Sprite Dragons, a very aggressive card. You have many other cards that can actually, put in some work. And it's the same thing. You let one of those Embercleaves slip through. You let one of those Great Henges. You let one of those Ugins or Genesis Ultimatum slip through, and it's game over. No matter how well you controlled the board, no matter how many resources, and these other decks just do not suffer whatsoever from having that particular Haymaker card answered, because the rest of their deck is still going at full gears. And so that's, in my opinion, they're going to be running one of these decks, and if they don't do anything, it's just going to get worse and worse and worse. And the real problem is most of this is Throne of Eldraine. So the next sets that are coming out, either they're going to have some really busted cards they can push through and actually see play, or it's just going to be business as usual, and we're going to be kind of plagued with an entire Standard until next September of basically Throne of Eldraine being the focal point of the Standard. All right, that is a long rant. Holy 40 minutes. Kevin can talk today. I've got a lot of whining to do, I guess. But there's my whine. There's my rant for the week. Let me know in the comment section below what you think of Standard, if I'm way off the mark. But I think that this Goldfish is pretty misleading too, because they're putting in a lot of decks that aren't doing well. And I even saw some tournaments here that obviously these top 5 decks were banned. And let's see if I can find it again. They had one on here and it was all like different decks, and there's no way, no how. The biggest problem though is these league decks. This is always a bad indication of how well MTGO is, because what they're going to do is they're going to show you archetypes that saw play. Like, they're not going to show multiple copies of decks. And it's not, this is it. This is the only ones that were able to 5-0. There weren't even any other archetypes that were able to 5-0 besides this one. So this is very misleading when they put this into the, into MTG Goldfish data as like the meta, because we don't know how many Gruul Adventures. There could have been 500 Gruul Adventures for this one Mono White aggro. And that is more likely the scenario than really this. And actually 2 of the Esper Doom Foretold's were able to be showcased because they were different enough. All it has to be is 10 different cards. And so these 2 had 10 different cards. You can see there's like Atris, and Mary's Call in this one. And then this one did not. Okay, this one had Mary's Call, but it had enough different cards between these 2 that it was able to hit this list. And so it's actually showing there's probably more Doom Foretold decks than statistically speaking in a real breakdown. I don't know why Wizards of the Coast is so afraid of data. Why they ban like Star City Games when they started to compile their tournament results, or they banned MTG Goldfish when they started to do their data mining and finding like all the decks and whatnot. So kind of dumb in my opinion. I'll have to check the arena stats to see where it's at with Gruul Adventures, but Gruul Adventures is like every other deck you're going to play against Gruul Adventures. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this video. This has been Kevin with Rogue Deck Builder. Thanks for watching.